Well, here we are at the end of Chapter 4, and we're going to look today at some more aspects as we close out Chapter 4 of Psychology. We're going to take a look at personality a little bit more in depth as we take a look at the Myers-Briggs type indicator and some other aspects of just our attitudes towards people. So let's go ahead and begin this final section in Chapter 4. Now, Theory X and Theory Y is a theory that was developed by a guy named Douglas McGregor, and it really categorizes people into two realms. The Theory X type of leader assumes that people are basically lazy and not motivated to work, and that they have a natural tendency to avoid responsibility. Theory Y assumes that people do not inherently dislike work and will commit themselves willingly to work that they care about. So let's examine this a little bit more. The assumptions of Theory X is that the average human has an inherent dislike of work. Because of their dislike for work, they need to be prompted. You need to be able to give them rewards and punishments which will motivate them, which when you get into behavior theory, you'll see that there are motivators and things that will really help people behave the way you want them to behave. And that's kind of the Theory X person. This came back from the autocratic, authoritarian type of management style, which really didn't have much of a regard for people. So the Theory X individual believes that if you turn your back, the worker is going to do his or her best to kind of slack off or really not do the work, so you have to manage that person with rewards and punishments. Theory Y, they're opposite. They believe that given the right motivation and if you encourage them, they're going to do a good job. They're inherently wanting to do well. No one really wants to fail. And it's been my experience over the years that really there's both. There are people who all I had to do was tell them what to do, give them the tools to do it, and they did the job. And there's others, no matter what you did, you had to keep an eye on them because they would not work. They just wanted to be there for a paycheck, and the least that they could do, that was what they were going to do, just the minimum. So it's been my experience that, people have really both tendencies. But what McGregor argues and what you need to reconcile is what are your attitudes and assumptions about people. Now, granted, we're going to have both in the workplace, but what is your natural tendency in your belief about people? Do you believe at the heart of your philosophy on people that they are lazy or that they need to be motivated, and without that they won't get the work done? Or are you that encourager? Are you that person who believes the best in people? So Theory X and Theory Y really kind of categorizes people into those two realms where we either look at the worker as someone who needs micromanaging or a system of rewards and punishments to get them to work, or the Theory Y, which is more trusting and more encouraging and wants to really enlighten and equip the worker to do better, because if they have those resources, they're going to do a good job. Now, perception. Perception is the process people use to make sense out of the environment by selecting, organizing, and interpreting information. Now, when you get to values and attitudes and so forth, a lot of it is going to determine how you perceive the world, and how you perceive the world is going to affect your attitude and your behaviors. And really, perception is a very subjective process. For instance, when 9/11 occurred, here we looked at it as a cowardly, awful, tragic event. in our history, and we perceived it as such. Over in the Middle East, they were having a carnival. They were throwing candy out in the streets. Why? Because they perceived it to be a heroic act by martyrs who really shook their fist at the American, capitalism and extremism and all of that stuff. So, and the police will tell you that, it's best to get a person's testimony or witness statement very quickly, and you can have two people view the same event and get two different outcomes from it. They perceive it two different ways. So perception is one of those things that you have to really, to understand it, you have to know that it's an individualistic thing. And I tell people that reality is not as important as perception in many cases. You can be doing everything above board in your organization, but if you are perceived to be doing wrong, that can still prompt a person to do all kinds of negative things. So perception is a big issue, not only in psychology, but in business and in ministry. Now, there are some perceptual distortions that your book talks about, perceptual defense. These are errors in judgment that arise from inaccuracies in the perceptual process. You misjudged something because you perceived it to be one thing and it wasn't. Stereotyping, and that's the tendency to assign a broad category, an individual to a broad category, and then generalize about the group. For instance, women can't drive. That's a stereotype. Or men are not good bringing up children or whatever. You stereotype. You take an individual and you categorize that person to a broad generalization, or you make generalizations about it. Halo effect. And that's the impression of a person or situation based on one characteristic, either favorable or unfavorable. I had a young man who worked for me in security, and the president of the company found out that he liked, or he was in the military, and that he was a police officer, and that one thing really made this president excited about him, and everything about him was glowing and so forth. Of course, we know that there are faults in everybody, but sometimes you may have an attribute that you see in someone that's favorable or unfavorable, and all of a sudden they rate that person high in everything. They make them into a super person or a super police officer or what have you. You have projections, tendency to see one's own personal traits in other people. You remind me of me when I was younger, or, I see me in you. And I've had people say, it seems like we're cut from the same cloth. These are people who are projecting. They see their own personal traits in other people. And then perceptual defense, and that's tendency to protect yourself by disregarding ideas or situations or people that are unpleasant. So, and that's what we're doing today, I believe, in society. If we don't agree with each other, or if we disagree with ideas or the people, we tend to protect ourselves. We don't let them filter in. We don't take into consideration what they have to say. We just block them off. Now, attributions. Once you perceive, then you're going to make attributions, and these are the judgments about what caused a person's behavior. A lot of times, either characteristics of the person or the situation. Now, the next slide talks a little bit more about this when it comes to internal attributions and external attributions. An internal attribution are the characteristics of the person that led to the behavior, or the situation caused the person's behavior. Let's say, for instance, a job didn't get done, and it might be a malfunction in the process. Well, the person at the lead of that group or that person who is operating or didn't meet the requirement, you may attribute the failure of that project to the person. Well, so-and-so just is not up to the job. So you lead that idea about that person to that person's characteristic. The situation caused the person's behavior, an external attribution. Let's say that this same person was working and they were successful. Well, you may attribute that to, well, that's just the technology that the person had. That person couldn't have done it without so-and-so, or this, that, and the other. So we make internal attributions. We always blame it on the person when it could be external environments and influences. And then we have external attribution where we never give the person credit. We always attribute it to something else outside the person. Now, the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to underestimate the influence of external factors or another's behavior and overestimate the influence of internal factors. So when you generalize a person's output or behavior based on external factors, then you are making, when you are overgeneralizing it, you're making a fundamental attribution error. And also, too, when you overestimate the influence of internal factors and overestimate the influence of external factors. So what you're doing is really looking at the effects that the environment may have on the person, but also you are, most often when you are trying to, as a leader, when you are reprimanding or you have to address a weakness or whatever, we have the tendency a lot of times to attribute it to the person instead of the situation. Self-serving bias is the tendency to overestimate the influence of internal factors on one's successes and the influence of external factors on one's failures. So if you have let's say, for instance, you get 100 on an exam. Well, I'm just super smart. I have an IQ of 500, and it's all on me. But the test that you were given might have been just a one-question test, and do you like ice cream or not? And put yes or no. I'm going out there, but what you're doing a lot of times with self-serving bias is that you're patting yourself on the back for everything and overestimating yourself in the successes. And also, when it comes to failures, you're always blaming the environment. It wasn't me, it was someone else. I was telling you about my buddy and the locus of control and so forth. This is kind of similar to that. Cognitive style, and that's how a person perceives, processes, interprets, and uses information. Cognition is a term we use in psychology that depicts thinking, how your brain processes information and so forth so that you can use it. And it's kind of like a computer. You bring in input, you distribute that input internally and store it, and then you bring it back, retrieve it when you need it. Now, when it comes to cognition and the brain, you have those who are left hemisphere dominant and those who are right hemisphere dominant. The left hemisphere, they're logical, analytical. They think of a linear approach to problem solving, which is a step-by-step, inline progression. The right hemisphere type individuals, they're the artsy type of people. They're creative, intuitive. Values are based on thought processes and so forth. So they're not just step one, step two, step three. They're taking a look at really the whole and being able to create or build off of or really think about what it is that they're looking at, but not in a logical or analytical manner. They're looking at it from a whole different side of a person's perspective. Now, the whole brain concept is an approach that considers not only a person's preference for right brain versus left brain thinking, but also conceptual versus experiential thinking, and it identifies 4 quadrants of the brain related to different thinking styles. So let's take a look at the diagram here in the next slide that kind of gives us an idea of what they're talking about. The whole brain, and this is your brain right here, the upper left is the logical area. The upper right is the holistic intuitive. This is the side of the brain or the portion of the brain where you try to take individual pieces of data and synthesize it. The lower left is the planning and detailing. This is the linear type of thinking. And then the lower right is the feeling based, where you have that emotional intelligence and you have that affect that we call emotion and so forth. So this is how Herman would map out your whole brain and in those quadrants. Now the Myers-Briggs MBTI is a type indicator that kind of classifies people within a broad range of those quadrants and so forth. It measures how individuals differ in gathering and evaluating information for solving problems and making decisions. The Myers-Briggs is a popular test in business that people are often given to be able to indicate how they are going to perform and how or if they're going to succeed within that particular environment. Now, the Myers-Briggs, as you see here, it uses different pair of attributes to classify people. You have introversion versus extroversion. Now, if you remember us talking about that, an introvert is kind of a reserved person. They're not very outgoing. They are usually deep within thought or within themselves and so forth, and they really don't like public situations. An extrovert has no problem in public. They're outgoing. These are the type A individuals who are aggressive at times, or they can be. They're assertive, may be a better term for that, and they never met a stranger. They are comfortable in social circles, even with people that they don't know. They just have that type of personality. Sensing versus intuition. Here you use your senses, or people rely on their senses to gather information, and some people use intuition to be able to come to information and so forth. Then you have the thinking versus feeling type person. And this is the type of person who is more logical. They are analytical, whereas the feeling person, as we saw in the lower right-hand column or quadrant of the brain, these people are more feeling. They have more of a desire to connect with people emotionally, so forth. Judging versus perceiving. These are the ones who are taking a look at really making judgment calls, and perceiving is just they're deriving information on their perceptions and so forth. So any and all of these within the confines of a proper context can be very useful. But again, if you go overboard with it, if that strength becomes a weakness, then these can hurt you. You may be over-emotional and not able to really function in the midst of controversy or conflict. You may be such an introvert that you can't break out of your shell and really interact with people. So knowing that each and every one can be a strength, also a weakness, will help you, and to know the parameters in which these dimensions really fall can help you a lot also. Whether it's in business or in ministry, God created us differently, and He created us to complement each other and not to be at odds with each other. Not that conflict is negative all the time, but at least by knowing people's personalities or how personalities manifest themselves can help you to better understand people and be a better manager.